So Max, great to have you on. Thanks for joining me today. It's a pleasure.
No, thank you, Rob. This is phenomenal. I've been looking forward to it.
So I do want to start with a bit of your origin story. The more I look into your background and your life, Max, it seems like you've lived a really interesting and diverse life already, and you're only still young, unless you've got some kind of secret and you're actually 60 years old and just still look
We'll talk
really
about
young.
that later.
But yeah, I just wanted to delve into that origin story a bit more. How yeah, you've seemed to have lived in several countries, speak several different languages, so it seems very much a part of who you are. So how did you kind of your origin story evolve? How did you end up moving from Germany to North Carolina to work with bees?
Yeah, no, there's thanks a lot, Rob. There's a couple of wrinkles to this story, and I think so languages have always been, it always been a huge part of like who I am and what I do. And so I grew up in Germany with the Swedish mother, so I kind of always like from the get-go flip-flopping between different languages. And I think that was sort of Mum was a stewardess as well, so that may have helped to kind of, always longing for going somewhere else and like moving abroad, doing different things. So I actually went to high school in Argentina, which was the first like real outside of home, kind of leaving your comfort zone experience when you're like 16 and you just move into another side of the world, basically. And back then there was also, the pre-smartphone time. So it was like, okay, there was a little Skype schedule that you had with your parents on a weekly basis, but that already kind of just showed you so much how it is to live in a different place. Like how do people talk and care and do things in different ways and in a different culture and a different religion. And I think that was sort of the gateway drug to me, I guess. I kind of think the bilingual uprising prepared me, and then Argentina basically was that little door that I stepped through and I never looked back. And since then, I've always wondered, what happens if there's another culture that does things slightly differently? What is another component to do that? So that also happened a little bit in my studies. So I was like, when I had lived in Argentina, I was very much for the first time exposed to lots of, economic inequalities, if you will. So I guess I did what one does as a 16 or 17-year-old, which is like, I need to fix this. It's like, this is something that I want to do. Whatever I need to study, whatever I need to get done, it's like I can come back and I can just, turn things around. Which brought me to economics. And I think, if somebody had told me that it's much more about like statistics 101 or math 101 than saving a country, I'm not sure if I would have still gone for it, but that's what I did. And that got me more and more into like agricultural economics. So I quite quickly, again, this was Argentina, which one of the few countries that taxes agricultural outputs, so agricultural exports, which is something that was wild to me, kind of growing up
Mm.
in the European Union, where like subsidies was all the talk, and that got me into sort of the agricultural component and really starting to think about, okay, what is nature? How do we live with nature? What are the agri-food systems? Which led me to do rural development and food and resource economics from the type was a double master's degree. And of course, kind of like building on that, trying to hack the system and doing as many countries and as many languages as I possibly can. I went for an Erasmus Mundus program that was like, okay, can I get two titles within like 2 years studying in three different countries? That sounds like my program. So that's what I signed up for and did did Belgium and then a little bit of Germany again, and then my second master's in South Korea. So that was really kind of the another component to get to as many places as I could. And then that was the gateway basically to the United Nations. So kind of with what I studied, I thought first thought I may have been a little bit in the niche here, kind of like who would want to hire somebody who does rural development and food and resource economics. But when you start to work for an organization that is called Food and Agriculture Organization, people start to appreciate what you did. And that was, yeah, the first work or the first job straight out of college was then moving to Rome, picking up another language, getting to know another culture, and staying there for 2 years.
So you're growing this kind of cultural yeah background, learning all these different languages, these different um countries. So how does that then end up, like, where's the leap to getting you to working with bees and what you're working on now with HiveTracks, going from your work at the UN to that? How did that play out?
Yeah, and I think that was it. It kind of it makes sense looking backward. It didn't make sense at all. Kind of
Yeah,
like again,
it
it's
never
always so
does.
easy to connect the dots after the fact. So, my main area of work was research and extension. So that's where I started, and it was all about working with technologies and practices to empower smallholder producers. And most of the work we were doing was literally PDFs of like good practices that smallholder producers could use, and over a third of them was in beekeeping. So how can beekeepers mostly across South America, across Africa, Southeast Asia, some, but some limitations to the languages, how can they be empowered with these technologies and practices? And that was when I kind of realized, okay, there has to be a smarter and more efficient way to get these technologies and practices into beekeepers' hands. And much of the UN is built on kind of this top-down extension model where you train trainers who train farmers basically, and you have this workshop organization. I thought there has to be a more data-driven, a more technology-driven way of catalyzing knowledge and putting knowledge into the hands of smallholder producers. And fortunately, and this was one of the absolutely coolest things about the UN was the constant conferences, right? It was like Global Soil Day, International Water Day, and you would have all the, this was pre-pandemic, so you would have all the experts of the world being flown in or travel to Rome and then given talks. And one of these conferences was a roundtable on how bee data can help with the sustainable development goals. And there was two professors from a university in North Carolina giving a talk. And what they presented basically was work they had done on a software, on a technology that beekeepers, over 40,000 beekeepers across 150 countries had used, mainly to just use it as a passive record keeping tool to just keep track of their own data. And that's kind of where I both personally clicked with the two professors and was like, hey, what you do is very, very interesting. Plus, I was like, okay, what happens if you take this passive record keeping tool that lots of beekeepers around the world are doing, and you start to, one, look at it a little bit more from a government angle, and two, start to look at what happens not just in the hive, but around the hive. And that's sort of the origin story, how we got to chat. So it took us another year, I'd say, and a pandemic and lots of other things, of course. But that's when we decided, okay, should we continue to publish about this topic and talk about this topic at the UN level, or shall we incorporate and build a company out of this and figure out a way how I could move from Europe to this town of Boone in the Appalachians in North Carolina.
So after all those countries and places you've been, Boone was probably not somewhere you thought you'd be living at the moment, but it's you enjoying it?
Yeah, no, I mean people seriously, question my sanity. It's quite an interesting component. I've like had so many of my dearest friends of my family. My family just recently visited me here or over there, I must say now. Um, and it has been just wild for people to how much they did not understand how I would be moving from, any be it Rome, Italy, or like be it Seoul in South Korea or even Berlin to a small town like Boone, North Carolina. But there's an interesting part to the story where the first time they invited me over, I came to a beautiful fall week. So the whole area, the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Appalachians, and I, Rob, you've been there, so you know a little bit of a little bit of it. It's very much known for specifically the fall colors, right? When the leaves change their colors, it's just magnificent. It's a really, really, really nice part of the country, and so they invited me over for the week. They call it peak week.
Yeah.
And I always say, that
Strategically invited you over at the
there
week.
you
Yeah.
go. If they had invited me over for like third week of January or like second week of February, I'm not sure if I would fall in love the same way. But which is very interesting is again, I had always felt specifically at the UN, and this is, I guess, I think, Rob, you may be feeling something very similar, is like when you're a little bit too far removed from what you actually want to do. And I think much of the work at the UN is something that I would love to come back to, which is more of the political work,
Mm.
enabling and frameworks. And I found myself, talking about how can we increase the resiliency of like local agri-food systems as an example. But it's like, what am I doing in my daily life? How what are my daily habits and what way are they contributing toward this goal, which may be, more resilient agri-food systems. And in Boone, North Carolina, which has a very, very interesting food scene, a very strong farmers market culture, for the first time, I also realized that I could walk the talk a little bit more. So I
Mm.
was like able to of course, there's certain things that you can't have access to because you are in a rural area, but contributing to, when somebody studies rural development and food and resource economics, it's like being able, with everything you do in a day, to be able to contribute to that kind of lifestyle. And then suddenly realizing that, wow, when you open your fridge, about 75 to 80% of the food that's in there, the person who harvested it. Like, literally the person who got the food from and is who's responsible for making sure that the growing seasons are kept in check and so on and so forth. And in a way that aligns with the values that I have and the way I want to see my food grown and a local economy to be working. And that really fascinated me, where I kind of said, okay, I want to try this out. I want to give myself the chance to live this and understand more about, how agri-food systems work. And again, it also really was almost opposed to the image that I had of the US, and moving to a city where, I had always these images of these huge supermarkets with these wide selections.
Mm.
And I never had thought really about, okay, what would it look like if I could actually live a very sustainable life, if you will, or at least a local war or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, that disconnect between a lot of people working on policy or working and then the farmers or whoever it might be producing the products. I know I've suffered from that myself growing up in a town, moving to a city.
Mhm.
It was only through my more recent work in rewilding and working with farmers that I've actually been speaking to a lot more people on the front line, I guess, in terms of understanding the difficulties that are actually facing them, whether it's through climate change, through biodiversity loss,
Yeah.
or just the prices of we're expecting for food in the supermarket. So I think closing that gap is a challenge that
Mhm.
we've got to overcome. And if I'm someone who I think is fairly well attuned to the environmental pressures and things, myself was quite naive to a lot of the challenges. I think it's an interesting challenge that's only getting more and more difficult in terms of that disconnect between where our food comes from and the actual people who consume it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it is so, again, these are one of the things that they're so easy, right, to just oversee, because we're almost trained to not question those kind of things. And I think there's two components to it. One is really that we just grow up with this notion of, resources come from different, the electricity comes kind of from the plug on the wall, and
Yeah.
food comes from there. And I remember, I was out, I may have been 5, 6, 7, something like that, and I was out with my mom, and I asked her, we were about buying some food or something, or some candy for me probably. And she was like, well, we don't have any money anymore. This has to be it for now. We're not gonna get any more candy. And I was like, why don't you just go to the ATM and get some more money? And that's sort of the same view that we treat food, in a certain kind of way, that we go to the supermarket and we don't, it's just something that is always there. It's a little bit the light switch that you turn on. And I think that's kind of the one thing that we all grow up not, or potentially not with the same appreciation, or just removed from where the action is, where it actually happens. And it's something that's actually one of, also the areas in the UN, and something that has been accompanying through my life. I love thinking about supply chains, right? And what is the supply chain, and how can you at least maybe virtually shorten it, right? Which is something that on the farmers market has fascinated me so incredibly much. It's like you can buy something literally from the person who produced it, cared for it, built it. And that's always something that kind of that little craftsmanship, right? And that's also where the technology data angle comes in. What means do we have to combine these two, and kind of have combine a more of a romantic view, which is like, buying something from somebody who produced it or did it, which has of course its scalability issues, but using data to make it a little bit more efficient. And then I think the second aspect to that problem is that we're so used to treat things theoretically, if you will. I think that's the whole, I mean, when you go into university and then you do this paper and you look at kind of, trade statistics, or you look at pricing statistics, and that's the way that as a young human being, when you go to university and you're not exposed to these kind of things, that's how you are taught to approach problems, right? Which is obviously one way of doing it, and not a way we should stop doing with, but it lacks so much else. As you were saying, it kind of builds this naiveness to say, well, if I do know these numbers, I have looked at the price changes, or I've looked at different ways of how the input costs could change. And that's something that is just fascinating when you for the first time interact with, you call them frontline workers, and you're like, okay, let me start over. Here's a lot that I didn't know.
Yeah, we need to be humble for sure, but it's quite sad in a way. I think there has been a potentially deliberate masking of people to from the kind of challenges and where food comes from. It kind of plays into the hands of supermarkets and certain and people like that. But I remember one time I saw on TV they were interviewing inner city children about where milk came from.
Ooh.
And I think that 3 out of the 5 they asked on the TV just said the fridge or
Yeah,
the supermarket.
there you
They
go.
couldn't, and they asked, but where does it come from before that? And they didn't know. And I just thought that was really, really sad. And yeah, it's becoming more and more of a problem, even to the point where, through some of my work looking at the supply chain side of things that you were talking about, even some of the companies that are stocking the shelves that are producing the food are unaware of some of the complexities of the supply chains. They're getting even more complicated. They're international. They have all these different factors at play. So you can understand why the consumer is confused if the companies that are producing the food in some situations don't even know where the supply chain goes or where the product originated.
Yeah, no, of course. And that's, I guess, also this complexity that just makes us shut down, right? We're kind of we have to some degree abstract or simplify or have some mental model that helps us to not deal with certain things. And there's so much attention you can give and have in any given day. And then kind of choosing, choosing your areas where you would like to pay attention. And I think that's also something that is so interesting of like the behavioral, the nudging, the habit component, basically, that is as much plays as much a role as the knowledge component, right? Where we kind of oftentimes, again, this may be a very idealistic view. We're like, whoa, but people should know this by now, or like there's so
Mm,
much education, or people have heard this. It's like, yeah, but how many things don't you know about that are good slash bad or something for you, and you still behave in a way that you've just learned and trained. And that's, I think, the other component that we hadn't talked about enough, that it's not just kind of this incredible complexity of like these food webs or the supply chains, but then again also there's so much that is ingrained in the way we grew up on, like, if you grew up in the 90s or in the 80s, what are the kind of foods or the kind of brands that you're attracted to. So I
mm,
think there's so many more items that we need to break up. And I think that's also an opportunity for when we now start to talk about biodiversity a little bit more, which again has the very same problem of being one of the most complex systems that we could possibly think of, which means it's very, very hard to measure anything. It's very, very hard to draw any like kind of direct cause effect correlation slash causation ideas into it in any time frame, if you will. And then again, you have a few of these, heroes of biodiversity, or a few, I would say, animals that people are very fond of or have very positive emotions for when they see. I mean, in our world, the honeybee is obviously one of
mm.
these animals that a lot of people are like, oh wow, what is, I don't know, what's the most, what's the animal that invokes the most sympathy? I think there's a couple of questions. Could be the honeybee, maybe a dolphin, hummingbird. I think it's another. I think there's a few of these animals where people are like, okay, so how do you go from that? How do you take, here's something that symbolizes biodiversity. Here's something we want to protect. And then at the same time, trying to come up with systems that allow us to track biodiversity, measure biodiversity, and kind of reduce complexity to a degree, while at the
Mm.
same time, almost leverage the complexity to make it as good job as possible. And that's, I think, the conundrum that we all have to be working on and work hard on over the next few days and years.
Yeah, I want to delve into that topic a bit more now, Max, if we can, and talk a bit more about what you're working on at HiveTracks. And yeah, the future of biodiversity monitoring. It's a really hot topic at the moment. Everyone's suddenly realized that we can't really solve the biodiversity nature crisis, call it what you will, until we really understand what's going on. You can't change what you don't measure or monitor, is the saying. But as you said before, biodiversity is this really complex topic. It varies, from all over the world depending on where you are. This word biodiversity changes, and how you measure it and how you're able to measure it changes as well. And with in my work on this podcast, and I'm looking at a lot of different nature tech solutions that are coming out, and various companies saying that they can tackle this problem, they can help solve this, and there's lots of money coming into the sector as well because companies are getting pushed to understand the risks that their supply chains or whatever have on biodiversity, and the risks that are posed on those companies from biodiversity loss as well. So there's this huge need to understand biodiversity and to get this data, and this almost an arms race at the moment to try and figure out how to do it. So how are you approaching this problem? How do you see, I mean, you said that bees are a really charismatic animal. They're something that perhaps strikes a chord a bit more than a satellite or a drone or something that might be another potential way of monitoring biodiversity. So how can we use bees to potentially solve this issue, or help us solve this issue around monitoring biodiversity and measuring it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, and I agree. I think it's fascinating to watch how, like the world is waking up to nature. Maybe that's
Hmm.
that's a little bit a
Finally.
way of putting it.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think there's been a lot of focus on climate, and now kind of like now happens what always happens with like the twin crises, if you will. It's like, okay, how can you ensure that there is enough attention on the new one without losing attention for the old one,
Hmm.
if you will, or having the two, treating them equally important, and maybe now giving the nature space a little bit more help because it is so nascent and it's just now getting started. And I think the key thing here too, that which to me is really really important, is that we don't jump over any steps in this process toward getting it right
Mm.
with measuring impacts on nature and measuring biodiversity. And I think there is, again, biodiversity is so incredibly complex that it's important that I believe that there's lots of different companies that can focus on one particular aspect within biodiversity that you would like to monitor. And that's also something that we feel we can do, that there is one very thin, small slice in biodiversity that we could get very good at monitoring in a meaningful way. And then collaborating with all the other players that are out there and kind of their, maybe the satellite imagery company, then maybe the other company that does some metabar coding, and like looking at these different companies to see how can you get the most complete picture of biodiversity over time. And what we try to contribute to solving this problem with HiveTracks is that, we've been working with beekeepers all over the world for over 10 years now, and really trying to, how can we you create a digital place for people to jot down their notes, to get like guidance based on what they see, their observations on the hive, and basically improve their bottom line, improve their skills as beekeepers. Anywhere from somebody who is more of a backyard beekeeper who is just getting started, all the way through more of a beekeeping business where the help that beekeeping businesses need is less of a personal guidance and recommendations and education, and much more focused on an operational efficiency. What do I need to get done
Mm.
on what day to ensure that that happens? And what we realized quite quickly is that when working with thousands of beekeepers, is that specifically over the last 20 years, I would say maybe 15 years, there's been more and more pressure on hive health, right? So there's many factors that obviously influence hive health, and many of them have to do with the direct environment of the hive. So it can be a changing climate, it can be exposure to any agrochemicals, as an example, to different types of pollution. So there's just this myriad factors that for all of a sudden, even pathogens, diseases. There's so many things that beekeepers need to keep track of, that much of the knowledge that we had in the past may no longer apply in the same way. So there's like this need for, again, using technologies to get better at monitoring hive health and responding quicker and in a better way to the information at hand. And one of the big factors that we realize is that what happens around the hive really is as much as important as what happens inside the hive. And beekeepers were more and more requesting, hey, what are the blooming patterns in my area, right? So what happens on the east coast of the US, for example, it's the maple bloom, right? The maple bloom kind of starts on the down south and then creeps up the the entire East Coast, and you basically know it's almost like an indicator for where it blooms that, you know, a little further up north it will happen again. And that's sort of what we realize is like, okay, what happens if we allow beekeepers to have more information on all the blooming flowers and the foraging activity of bees in a particular hive? And what happens if thousands of beekeepers collect that data on a continuous basis? And that's when we really realized that the most interesting thing is that, if you will, think of a hive as like the interface, right? It's like this
Mm.
human biodiversity interaction. It's the interface between the two that has a couple of very interesting components, which really mean you have the same people going to the same spot every week, taking up the same data. So if you really think about kind of a continuum somewhere between citizen science to a lab testing or an approach like that, it sits somewhere in the middle, because you have
Mm.
it's a citizen science kind of basic, because it's individuals who may not have a biology or ecology PhD, who use pictures mostly and observations, recorded observations, standardized observations on a frequent basis, but they do so with in a standardized process, right? They do so with a quasi-scientific regimen that we've worked on a lot to get these questions right for a typical hive assessment, and do so, you know, through taking pictures that are analyzed by machine learning and other algorithms to make sure that the information there is true. So really, it's harnessing not so much the bees, but it's like this age-old relationship between the beekeeper and the bee, and the fact that they come to the same spot and with their knowledge share and improve knowledge about local biodiversity, but at the same time get to a point where we can collect better data more efficiently and in a ground truthed way, right? So really solving for lots of other methodologies may have a timing issue or may have a resolution issue, to kind of make sure there's again this little chapter, this little slice of data that we can collect in a good way to work with other players in the environment and complement what they're doing to get, again, the most complete picture of biodiversity.
There's so much I love about what you just said there in terms of, you know, we have to collect as much data as possible, but it can't just be meaningless, sporadic data that's collected at different qualities and at different, you know, just all over the place. And I think that has been, I love citizen science and what it can do and the engagement side of things. But in the past, I've always thought it's lacking in terms of quality, and particularly as we enter a world where greenwashing, rightly so, is becoming more and more of a prominent issue, and companies are being asked to collect this data, but they're nervous around quality, and if they were to use citizen science data in the past, potentially that would have been challenged, and rightly so in a lot of cases. You know, who can prove that? So I think we're at a really interesting point now, and I think HiveTracks sums this up nicely, that we can now start using what is sort of citizen science data, or looking at what people are out there that can help us collect data in a more efficient way. It has so many benefits in terms of reducing the amount of middle people who you know, so more money goes to people working on the solutions themselves, or who are in the field. But you know, there's so many benefits to it potentially, and then you start thinking of other uses for this type of thing. You know, is that beekeepers is just a small sector, but that you could start looking at the wider farming sector or other people that are out there. Suddenly, when you talk about technology like photographs and machine learning, or you know, apps that standardize things, it becomes a really, really powerful tool for collecting this data in a useful way.
Yeah, it's always, you know, we talk a lot about this community-based, you know, monitoring. It's like, so how can we, the community-based data collection, how can we tap into very active communities that are already there? They're already doing it on a regular basis. And how can we create again the mechanisms that they are incentivized to do to do just that, right? So what means are there, again, this is the what that I dream of, that this becomes an additional revenue stream
Mm.
for people in the area. And I think this is also, again, there finding smart ways that are sustainable to collect this data over time. That's, I think, the actual component, because I'm not so interested in just this one data point today. I'm more interested in building a relationship that allows that over the next, I mean, this is the other interesting thing about biodiversity. The cycles are so long. It's
Mm.
like, we need this to happen for the next 25 years, right? And there's like, again, and this is to make something continuously over 25 years, that's tough. That like
Hmm.
takes a lot of time. That's really, really strong habit. So coming up with a way that kind of, if you have a love for something in particular, and this could be gardening or this could be beekeeping, and then also there is a way that this could add to you as a new revenue stream, as an income stream for you as well, that there is some way where you may be doing this, because you like it, and because um you're convinced, you're passionate about it and want to help with monitoring biodiversity. But there should also be a component that when we know here's a specific area in a town or next to a specific farm that is at risk or is particularly biodiverse. In both directions, I think it works. To then, depending on who owns the land, could there be a mechanism where people who help with either monitoring the lack of or monitoring additionality get compensated for that in an easy way. And what I
Mm.
like about this again is that it has to be decentralized. I mean, this is kind of the interesting aspect of, like, at the end of the day, biodiversity, and this is what happens with bees as well. It's the most local thing that we can do, because wherever you go, it happens, but wherever you go, it's slightly different, but it's still biodiversity, and it contributes to it. So, and that's kind of like from a philosophical standpoint, that's very much how, small scale farming or beekeeping even works, that it's like it is locally, or it is local globally, right? So it
Hmm.
happens almost anywhere on the planet, in a very local way, and it's a community that is, with a lot of pride, has been doing that for generations. So what means are there to tap into the knowledge, in a smart way, to, as you were saying, focusing on this frequent data collection process that really helps us understand and start to come up, one, with metrics to measure biodiversity in a meaningful way, to get things, monitor changes over time. And then three, start to develop, what are the goals? Where would we
Hmm.
like to go? What would we like to improve? And how can we make sure that we're on track to do that?
Yeah, I want to at that point bring in. I know you've talked about blockchain and that technology and how that again. So we're building this transparency, this data quality story, up and up and up, and improving it more and more. Is that something that you're already using at HiveTracks, or is it an ambition further down the line? And what I see it's a trendy term, but for people out there that are new to the word blockchain or who don't really know about how it works, what problems could it potentially help us solve in terms of data transparency and just improving the process of biodiversity monitoring?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And we're actually, yeah, we're very, very close to launching, a, I would call it, blockchain enabled solution. It's
Hmm.
technically a hash graph,
Okay.
to work with Hedera, but it's a very similar technology. And I think the most important thing, it is, you know, I think it's an immutable ledger, an immutable database, if you will. So it really helps to make sure that certain data points that get stored in an auditable way over time. And that's the real component. So again, the big advantage that it has, of course, is that at the point that data is stored on the database, it stays there and it can't be tampered and tampered with or altered. At the same time, of course, that makes it a little bit difficult, because, again, I mean, people like to say garbage in, garbage out, right? So there's a lot of these things which, by the way, happens to other big data applications or data storage units. It's like, if you don't have, as we talked earlier, a very good mechanism to ensure that you collect structured and good and mature data models to capture this data over time, you are running into big issues, because the best database storing technology or AI technology doesn't help you if the data in the beginning that you collect isn't the right one. So the blockchain, again, I think this has also changed from a few years ago, when we thought this technology could solve any problem in the world, and we would just need to put this amazing thing on it,
The
and then we
silver
would.
bullet,
The
finally.
silver bullet, exactly. We've been waiting during all this time. And now it's been many, many years since there, and we still haven't, the silver bullet never really. It was a long time in the making. So what we again, I believe that there is a lot of opportunities for specifically when we're talking about public ledgers, right? You could talk about public ledgers that in the biodiversity space, for example, that would be super exciting to see that a specific area has already been claimed or
Mhm.
improved or is being monitored, right? So if there was a publicly auditable information system where everybody could go in and kind of say, okay, yeah, this is like who owns this land? What is the state of biodiversity right here? Which again, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar as well with like what happened in the carbon space where there was certain scandals that happened because
Mhm.
such a system wasn't in place and it was a little bit more decentralized, where you could have stuff things like, double counting or these items where like when different companies from afar try to claim things that happened in a given space. And I think that's where blockchain technology or Hashgraph technology, any type of Web3 application can be really, really relevant. And the way that we the way that we do that is that we basically work through an independent validation capacity, an
Mhm.
independent validation entity that then writes it to
Mhm.
a hash graph to the Web3 application. So that gives us two benefits that, yep, the data gets saved to a Web3 application, to a blockchain, but it's validated before. So this is this notion to say, okay, whenever there is a record in our system, this is what we're working towards to be ready next year, is to say whenever there's a record that gets submitted, it's checked if the structure of the record is the right one. Is all the information in the record relevant? Is the information collected with, a timestamp, a location stamp? Is the information complete? And once that's done, the validation is sent back to our database, and then it's stored on a publicly auditable database. And that then, of course, as we start to work with many other players for them to see, okay, we not just know we are not the only ones who can claim that something actually happened, that a picture was taken of a flower or that a bee hive was inspected. No, there's now this publicly available ledger that tells just that story. And I think one last piece with that, which I'm very keen on as well, is to see knowing if you store something on a database and you know that it will always be there, right? There's like no way of tampering with it. What do you do with your privacy, right? What do you do, kind of like how much information do you display right here, knowing that nobody can ever erase any of the information that is on it? And specifically in the bee space, and I think in farming it is similar, certain aspects are just trade secrets, right? Your hive location for
Mm.
beekeepers is, I mean, your livelihood depends upon the location of this hive. So you do want to specifically know that people in your area don't take that up. So that's another component where we ensure that the companies who are integrated keep that data stored, and then the information that gets to the ledger is an approximation of the hive location as an example. And beekeepers can choose themselves like what is the approximation that we would like to see, which is following international standards. So there's items like this where I'm super excited about Web3 technology because it's maturing and it's maturing. And I think it will never be the silver bullet that we all expected, but there is a small slice. Again, there's a small reason for it where it could be solve a big problem and it works so in a good way. So we're excited to start testing that out early next year, so early 2024.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's a simple idea when you look at it top down in terms of the problem that it's trying to solve, the trust issue, which is so key, as you pointed out, with the Red Plus issues that have happened recently in the carbon market. We're not going to get many chances at this if we're going to bring the public along with us or bring companies along with us if we keep making, obviously, and I do go on about this quite a lot, that we should be allowed to make some mistakes
Yeah.
because like any industry or new technology, mistakes are made and you iterate and you fail and you build a new thing. But I do understand that when the stakes are high and you bring environmental problems in, we don't really get many goes at it. So I'm kind of glad that we've not rolled out all this blockchain technology and it's all gone wrong. And yeah, we've had all these issues. I think it feels like it's been a more gradual journey into it, and it will suddenly start seeing it being rolled out in more applications, like with HiveTracks. I've heard Hedera being coming out more and more. It seems like it's a a really good solution in this space. So yes, the idea, as I say, when you zoom out, is quite basic. It's all about trust, but getting it right and making sure that it actually works in an efficient way and isn't using loads of energy, for example, like the Bitcoin example, which is always used to for people who want to bash blockchain technology. So making sure we get it right is key, because we're not going to get many swings at it if we get it wrong.
No, no, yeah, I think you're absolutely right there, Rob. And I think the other component as well is like, to me, great technology almost disappears when you use it, in my
Mm,
opinion, right? So
yeah,
the to me, the better the technology, the more thought through it is. It's like the more seamless it becomes. And I think that's the other component with that as well. It's like you don't want people even to register that this type of technology is being used. And I think that's, for us too, it's a middleware. It's something that happens in the background to solve a problem that we shouldn't be having to be dealing with, right? Nobody really
mm,
like, oh, I only work with companies that use this type of database technology. It's like, no,
yeah.
you
That's
just
what I
want to
think
make,
is
yeah,
weird about blockchain, because you don't. There's so many things in life that we don't question how it works behind
yeah,
the scenes.
yeah,
Nobody's going like, oh, but could you tell me exactly how the internet works and break
yeah.
it down to? For some reason, with blockchain, everyone wants to know like exactly. It seems like it's even more of a dark art than everything else in the tech space, and that everyone needs to know exactly how it works.
Yeah, it's like,
Uh,
yeah, that's just so wild. It's like, yeah, I would never travel to the US because they only use 110 volts. And
yeah,
it's like, you kind of go, it's like, no, that's you want to make sure that it works when you plug it in. And I think that's this other component as well, where finding a nice, finding a good balance there. And I think that's, I mean, going back to, again, anytime you want to work with something that is so complex, and I think what you mentioned earlier is like, we need to have these sandboxes, right? We need to be able to, again, I'm a first time founder myself, so there's almost not a mistake in the sun that I haven't committed in one way or the other. Never out of bad faith. Always
yeah,
like trying something out and it didn't work, and then you have to kind of backtrack, change it, iterate again, and then move in a different direction, and then eventually it works. And I think the most common mistake that founders do, and I did myself, is to take too much time to do certain things, right? When you kind of
mm,
like, your gut tells you, you should have maybe fired that person or changed or tried something different or followed up quicker. But it took you a little bit of time because you were thinking that, like, some better solution would come up. And that usually is not the case. And you're like, okay, I could have just saved 3 months or 2 months or 1 month if
mm,
I had just done it a little bit sooner. And I think that's kind of this individual learning curve that every founder needs to go through, and that needs to almost happen. And it's almost very interesting that you have to do certain mistakes by yourself, no matter how many of those books you read, how many people you talk to. You're like, yeah, I can, I'm good, I got this. It's like, okay, I don't need that much. And then you do exactly what they have tried to avoid your farm, and kind of say, well, I told you so. Yeah, well, I wasn't ready for the advice on that piece. So that is something normal that will happen. And now the question to me in this space, is the biodiversity space, that happens, is like, okay, how do you create, how do you have both, right? How do you ensure that there's sort of a sandbox environment where there's founders who can try things, and there's a lot of sharing of knowledge. Again, as I said earlier, I think there's so many different companies that try to do one thing really, really well. But again, biodiversity just needs so many. So how can we, foster collaboration to make sure that it is so complex. We will have lots of companies that can collaborate to get to these data points. How do we ensure that we not jump over certain steps, right? So as you were saying, is like,
mm.
not just say, okay, oh, we just do it with satellite imagery, we're good. And then maybe there's a resolution problem, or we just use an eDNA aspect of it, but then maybe we don't have the time and space continuum that we would want to have, or like point in time assessments. And like, how do we from the get-go ensure, okay, rather than jumping to having the commercially perfect solution here that enables us to scale, how do we make sure that we, really cover our bases and do that? And then as an industry as well, how can we not do things that would harm all that we do together, because somebody was, again, coming around and claiming this is my silver bullet and I'm now able to do that, knowing that there may be still business problems to figure out, right? That all of a
Mm.
sudden we're like, compromising almost the progress that we're doing by falling prey for, a shiny new object or an opportunity that sounds a little bit too good to be true.
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of the obviously that bee coming back to bees again,
Mhm.
we talked about them being so charismatic, and I think another powerful thing is the fact that they're recognized globally, right? Or their beekeeping is something that's practiced all over the world, as far as I'm aware, or a lot of the world. I noticed it in some of your work. You've been to various places, and we've worked in various places, from sort of Ethiopia to Uzbekistan. So, is that again something that's we talked about community a bit earlier, and is it something that you're thinking about at HiveTracks in terms of building out a monitoring technology, the ability to be able to talk a common language with people around the world, using bees as a tool to do that, and something that can scale quite nicely globally?
Yeah, I think no, thanks for bringing that up. And that's to me, that is one of the most interesting aspects about working with beekeepers. And it's similar to working with farmers, right? I mean, these are people that live all over the world and work again at the intersection of biodiversity and society, if you will. So it's like
Mm,
somebody who works and again, there's really no cutting corners or anything around that. It's like it's just work at a rhythm that is determined by nature
hmm
anywhere in the world. And that is very humbling. That's very, very interesting and exciting to see that. And then also to realize that there are some things, foraging happens anywhere. It may be different bees in a different place, and it may be a different, it's called a home of the bees, right? It can be a hive, it can also be a log. It really depends upon where you are in the world. But some form of cadence of inspections or visiting an apiary or a yard, and some form of like honey harvesting will always happen the moment that it's beekeeping. And working with beekeepers, say in Uzbekistan or in Ethiopia, and also comparing problems very much, right? So in something
mm,
that happens a lot in Uzbekistan is that they are usually close to cotton fields, and cotton fields get a lot of agrochemicals or inputs, chemical inputs to help with the cotton production, which is one of the largest export goods for Uzbekistan. And that, of course, hurts the local honey that has been done in certain ways. And now they have to, one of the key issues that they work around and work with is like who is spraying what type of pesticides where, and how
mm,
much of them are being applied. And then in over in Ethiopia, maybe a little bit more that it's a very different type of beekeeping that happens there, and it's maybe a dearth periods that are getting longer that make it harder to work with your hives. So it's really interesting to look at what beekeeping communities have in common across different places, and then also I think there's this honesty in lots of small scale beekeepers that you can almost compare from different places. And the human aspect of it as well. I mean, much of the work that we've done in Uzbekistan and Ethiopia, it's very interesting to just see our technology being developed in Amharic and Uzbek, which
mm,
are just two languages that make it yeah, something you wouldn't have thought of maybe again some time ago. And then also working with through a translator obviously, but working with a beekeeper who is, I don't know, 76 and has not had that much experience with technology, say in Ethiopia, a woman beekeeper, and says, well, these are the things that I do when I look out for my hives. And working through technology, doing these user testing sessions where you can go through an app and look at if this is appealing to a beekeeper in that space, a beekeeper in that area. And I think it's very interesting then when you see how you can work together, and when beekeepers realize that some of their ideas and thoughts are now in the app, right? So when they go
right.
back and say, okay, wow, this is it. And when you work with in Ethiopia, this happened a lot. This was a group of women beekeepers who hadn't been exposed to smartphones before. And at the end of our training sessions, we're like changing screenshots in a Telegram group, right? Or we're using the app and showing what they were doing. And that's really, really neat when you work with beekeeping communities. And that's when you get this sense of, okay, cool. There's a very driven community that is fragmented, of course, because there's language barriers and there's components, but they all do the same. They try to accomplish the same thing. And that gives me a lot of hope. And I think, as you were mentioning earlier, that's something that I would, being able to serve more beekeeping communities all around the world, and being able to make that part of the professional pride almost, right? To keep the healthiest possible bees in a sustainable manner, while taking up data that explain how environments and micro ecosystems are changing and their health is changing over time.
Yeah, if you've taken on some big challenges into the language barrier, the cultural barrier, the age barrier, I guess, as well. And this is something, I'm a big promoter of nature tech and what it can bring, and how it can help enable people who are in these communities, these indigenous populations, to kind of help monitor biodiversity. But obviously, we do need to be, careful and cognizant that these are new technologies, and you can't just throw an eDNA kit or an audio recorder and a laptop at someone and expect them to, one, be able to use it, and two, be, want to adopt it or understand the benefits or it could bring. So yeah, it sounds like you're having it's a really good experience going out, working with these different communities around the world, and understanding they're at different points in their journey of technology and understanding. But obviously, they've got this huge, untapped, often knowledge bank in terms of biodiversity and what they're seeing happen. So it's just linking those two things, I guess.
Yeah, no, 100%. And again, it's like technology has to disappear, right? If technology works
Yeah.
well, it's almost unnoticeable. And that's the same thing there. And that's also when you realize, like, if your technology that you develop is like too complex, or you're like it's too much your brainchild or something. And this happens too, that you just overbuild. I mean, ask a founder who has not fallen in love with their idea a little bit too much, and then kind of built something that was like just overbuilt just because you loved it a little too much and you didn't want to hear exactly that. So that's one piece that you just have to, again, that I've fallen prey for 100 times as well, where you like ask yourself again, it's like, is this 100% necessary? Is it really what is required, or not? And that's I think something that companies that have to do, and founders to not overdo that really. And like the simpler you can keep it and the simpler you can get it, the easier it will be to scale across different countries. And it's same as like, if you can have an icon explain what a word could do, you don't have to do the translation, which oftentimes happens. So there's a lot of these things where you kind of, when you had to go back and forth for every little change into like 6 languages to like make sure that the translation happens, there's a few things you can avoid in the first place. And again, that's where like this relationship comes in. At the end of the day, it's human beings, and tech savviness is it's much more related to age than anything
Mhm.
else
Yeah.
around the world. And you may be the IT administrator for your parents as well as many in our generation are. So I think there's a lot to be said on that as well. So again, I think the much of the complex technologies can happen on the back end, and the way that we interact with it has to be very, very approachable and very, very simple. And that's, I think, we can't leave that out, and this human aspect of it. And then it doesn't really matter if you work in Uzbekistan or Ethiopia, or the US or UK, if you just keep that in mind, that the person you're talking to is the user, is the most important aspect in this. So keeping that in mind for any type of design, I think we can then, push back the more complex and interesting technology, potentially interesting technology, that is a little removed from the person interacting with an application or any type of interface.
Mm. And something I think we've skipped over a little bit, I just wanted to make sure we covered. We did talk about it briefly, but it's in terms of what you're actually monitoring with
Mhm.
the app. It's not all about data collected directly from the bees themselves, although that is one component of it. There's bringing in other elements that the beekeepers can get involved with, and I guess that could be potentially limitless. You could bring in other technologies that we've briefly touched upon in this conversation, whether it's acoustics or eDNA or photography. So what have you got kind of working at the moment? Obviously, you said it's step by step, isn't it? It's easy to jump to the end and be like, right, we're going to get them to do this, and this, and they're going to measure everything, and it's going to be this amazing solution. So what can the bees themselves monitor, I guess, and what can't they do, and what gaps need filling around that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Robin. So right now it's very beekeeper centric, right?
Right.
So in our it's a mobile app that is called HiveTracks that we use, which will be Yeah, we have some nice changes for next year, which will be quite exciting. And
Mm.
this is an app basically. So at first, the app helps you set up an apiary and your hive,
Hmm.
right? So this depends upon how many apiaries and how many hives you have. In the very beginning, what is set up, it's the GPS location, the terrain, and the environment on your apiary or bee yard. So that already helps you to pull in weather information, for example. And this weather information already allows us to see what are the flyable hours, right? What are the flight times
Hmm.
of bees for any given apiary? And again, flyable hours are one of my favorite concepts, right? Because you basically look at, is there daylight? Does it rain? Is there wind? And then you calculate how many of these hours, and of course the temperature band, how many of those hours are flyable. So that gives you a good understanding for like what type of pollination can happen at a given spot. So that's really the
Mm.
baseline. So I know the terrain, I know the environment, I have a GPS location on a map that allows me to have weather. So those are the core data to get your hive set up. And then how many of those hives do I have? What configuration of the hives do I have? What type of queens do I have? How old are the queens? So this is all set up where in the app, we've always tried to, you can go quick or you can go slow or you can go deep, right? It's almost those three depending upon how much guidance you need, what you want to log in terms of data. So if you just want to focus on the basics, you focus on the basics. If you do it really slow because you need a lot of help because it's your first time, that's fine too. Or if you want to go really deep because you love being very, very meticulous in all your data, you're good to go. And then think of it as a almost like, as a project management tool, really. So there's a few things you have to be doing throughout the beekeeping season
Mm.
to get it right on a cadence. And sort of the central piece of beekeeping is called a hive inspection. So that's what it's four questions that we ask on the population, the brood stages, food stores, and then any type of stressors that exist. So this is something that you would do once per week, once every 2 weeks, depending on where you are in the season. And then you answer certain questions to a degree or depth that you would like to. And this is, most you would do anywhere between maybe 6 to 18 of those throughout a season. And then in stressors, for example, you could log symptoms, right? It's either a disease or you log a symptom. In food stores, you would log how many frames you're seeing that have honey, for example. And you would, for each of those, you would have specific assessments as observations that always follow the same questions, the same pattern, and always give you an indication, is it a positive or a negative trend, right? Is the hive population looking rather positive or rather negative? And again, here, all questions can just be answered with yes, no, like thumbs up, thumbs down, or you need more guidance, or you can add more detail where you go in and add additional questions. And that's something last year we clocked in just north of, I think, 6,500 inspections all over the US. And sorry, all over the world with a big focus in the US. And apart from these inspections, which is again the bread and butter, sort of beekeeping, there's a couple of other records that you can collect, right? And these records can be anything from feeding a hive, treating a hive, documenting flora, right? Taking pictures of flowers that happen outside of it, marking that a hive is no longer, right? That died,
Mm.
unfortunately. Moving a hive, just doing a journal entry, just jotting down that you went there and, here's a little picture of it and it was a beautiful sunny day, or I mowed the lawn just around the hive. So
Mm.
that's the key functionality that is in the app. So it's the inspection and all the other practices that you want to perform. You can create them forward looking as to-dos to plan it out. You can just record that you did something with it. And then based on the data that you enter, two things happen. One, you get recommendations, right? So you do your inspection, you have a few things that are off. You get a recommendation in the app that says, hey, food stores seem low. It's been the second time in a row. You may want to monitor that and see what happens. And at the same time, there is, whenever somebody using HiveTracks does something, everybody else get a notification once a week that says, hey, 200 people are inspected their hives this week, or 50 people harvested honey this week, which is just interesting to see what other beekeepers are doing in the area, right? So that's again the data is really focused on some of the data pulling in from afar, and then the other is really structured observational data that is collected over time.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, there's I mean, there's so much you could do, so much you could build upon, but just by collecting that, what seems like quite basic data on its own as individual data points suddenly becomes really powerful, right? When you start seeing patterns, or you're bringing together, and it happens in farming as well. There's all this knowledge that's they're untapped in terms of what people are seeing day to day. Oh, there's slightly fewer of this bird have appeared or this year, or and suddenly you pile together all these different data points using something like an easy to use app, and it can start to show you patterns or interesting things that weren't as obvious before. So I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rob. And I think that's what excites us as well. And then for next year, we're launching a web version as well, which is quite exciting. So that makes it just easier to look at it on a map, for example.
Mm.
And again, to look more at when you start to have, 10, 25, 30, 50, or even many more hives, and you start to organize them across different locations, there's a lot more logistics that is involved, right? So being able to have an easy to use mobile app and a web app that you can have the two together. And then really on the web as well, you'll be able to monitor what is biodiversity, right? It's starting with an inventory of like, here's the flyable hours, here's the pollination events that your bees have contributed to on any given day as an estimate. Here's the flowers that are currently in bloom. Here is how that compares to flowers that are usually in bloom, right? That's another aspect that we have in the app just for the US at the moment. Based on where you are, here's the flowers that should be in bloom at the moment. So it's as you were saying, it's rather straightforward data points that get us in the direction of making sense of biodiversity, monitoring biodiversity, figuring out what additionality could mean. And that's, I believe, where, using a simple solution to get us in the right way to collect the baseline and then start to, as you were saying, there's so many other data layers, interesting aspects that we are already, companies that we're already talking with or companies that we would like to talk to in the future to get the most complete picture of biodiversity.
And again, talking about things you could potentially build in the future or that you might have one eye on, and coming back to the blockchain point, actually, um, I've noticed other companies working in a similar space talking about the idea of microfinancing and the idea of getting money directly to, well, in this case, it'd be beekeepers for doing that monitoring from people that want to, the companies that are trying to understand or that want to get hold of the data. Is that something you've thought about? Do you see it as a potential solution, or do you worry that it takes away from that citizen science element? I guess it's a bit different when you're doing it as a job, as a kind of an
Yeah.
industry, rather than asking people, who might do it as a hobby to get paid. Then you get into slightly interesting philosophical questions around payment for things. But yeah, is it something you thought about as a potential
Yeah,
option?
no, and I think again to me is, I would want, for whomever that this becomes a regular, regular activity over time, then they should get compensated for it. I mean,
Mm,
that's kind of the thing. If there's somebody who does it over a long time. Um, Also in terms of microfinancing, I think there's phenomenal opportunities to get that right. And in particular with, when it's the data that is being collected, and that's the way that we see it, right? So data that is being collected tells a story. Right, so that's actually, something that we're launching for next year. They're so-called honey stories. So
mm,
here's what happened around a hive. Here's when it happened over time, and then what happened and how it changed over time. This profile, this metadata profile, we call them biodiversity profiles and harvest profiles in the app. They tell a story of a lot of things, and it can either be an environmental impact, or it can be the origin story of a honey or a hive related product, or it can be the veracity of economical activity, right? Or the validation of economic activity. It's almost like a proof of work or collateral for
mm.
any type of leveraged services in microfinance, for example. So we believe that this is, the problem that we're currently trying to solve is again is to make technology disappear to get us to completing or collecting the most complete picture of biodiversity data. And we believe accomplishing that also gets us into a position where we could have a very strong microfinance opportunity ahead of us. So we've done some very, very basic proof of concept work with partners in Ethiopia because that's where it was most interesting to say, can your hive history and your harvest history give you access to this kind of data? But again, we believe that that is one of the avenues that we could delve into as soon as we've really dialed in what are the types of data points we need to be collecting, what are the right rhythms, the right frequency of the data collection.
Hmm.
And once that's taken care of, we believe that there's a couple of business models that could be unlocked quite swiftly, or again, where we could work with microfinance providers and say, hey, we have figured out a way that if beekeepers or smallholder producers do this, we can say with this accuracy that this is their financial capacity. And this could give them access to some microfinances for biodiversity monitoring. And here's how we get the validated data. You just can audit our Web3 stored data for that. So again, there's a lot of opportunities, but we really try to stay laser focused on one thing now, knowing that this would open up the door for other avenues as well.
Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself again. The mind's racing one step at a time.
Exactly. It's like you always try to, right? There's this new idea, and you're like, oh my God, that would be it. This would be great. And it's like, okay, let's just create this little, booklet. We have the plan ready. Let's have it here, and then let's focus at it as soon as we have the bandwidth again.
Shiny object syndrome. It's
There
something
you
that I
go.
keep training myself to be beher at. It sounds like it's something that most entrepreneurs go through, I think, in terms of when building out something.
I think, yeah. That's so true, Rob.
So there's one question I quickly wanted to address because I can hear ecologist colleagues, people working in nature, kind of more from an academic background, when we talk about honeybees, and there's been some stories recently, particularly in the UK, with urban hives and an increase in kind of the interest of urban beekeeping. And um, you mentioned earlier how they're a very charismatic species, and they definitely do capture the imagination of a lot of people. And I spend a lot of time kind of explaining to people that honeybees, and there's lots of species of bees, and honeybees are just one species. And that's often quite, yeah, that's quite a novel idea to a lot of people. Still, they've come to see the bee as the bee, and it's becoming more well known that there's lots and lots of different species. So is that something that you think about in terms of, because you're obviously looking at biodiversity as a whole, so you must be well aware of this, in terms of how do you manage that increasing interest, and you want to foster that interest if it can be beneficial, and then just kind of reminding people that we need to be careful that we should not be putting too many hives in the wrong place, or there's potential negative impacts if we don't keep our eye on that side of things.
Yeah, no, I think you're mentioning it quite, or you explained it quite well. I think the key education is the key part here, and I think again, if you try to promote biodiversity, which obviously is directly dependent upon the diversity and complexity in the number of species, by promoting one single animal, that's it's almost almost a funny thing to do. So I would say again, to me, the game is to say, can we use the charisma of such a keystone species as the honeybee to educate and to kind of ensure it's like it is in many ways it is a indicator because it's a managed insect. It's one of the few managed insects. So there's a lot about the health of honeybee that is an indicator for the health of many others, right? So there are some valid aspects of looking into that. But again, manage it carefully, right? There is a carrying capacity for different places, specifically when it comes to periods where foraging area is very much limited as a component. So I think always looking to see how many beekeepers are already there where we are. Is there something that we can do to increase foraging space, for example, to increase foraging or the availability of forage in the first place? And I think that again is increasing resilience of any ecosystem or any biodiversity locally increases the availability for different types of insects to coexist in a smart way. And I think that's you can solve any type of problem just by putting another hive, right? It's not like, oh, let's just, put 10 hives here and then we will have 10 times more biodiversity than if you use one hive. I think that's again, it's like whenever you try to cut corner on nature, it usually goes the opposite way. So that's also how we handle it. So just with a lot of education and material and kind of say honor the interest for insects and then using it again as an entry point to working with biodiversity and nature overall. And a lot of that happens that people say, "Oh, I love honeybees so much. What can I do?" Like, "Oh, I want to plant something." And there's, this is another thing as well. Just plant. If you can, if you have the time, is there something native you can plant? Is there something, something that is local to where you are? Is there something that again, could you plant something diverse? Could you ensure that there's something blooming from like March through November in the northern hemisphere because you planted in a nice way? So again, using this initial excitement basically to take somebody by the hand and lead them down the path and kind of say, okay, cool. Now that you're here, let's work on this together. Let's give you the materials and contents that you would love to see to educate you
Yeah.
as much as we can.
It's a really interesting challenge that I think
Mhm.
we need to get better at as a nature community promoting these things is I've tripped up before, and you need to come back to that point, as you say, that biodiversity is complicated, and
Mhm.
you try and find a silver bullet solution. Again, you're going to get tripped up, and I find I can almost hear the eye rolling when there's a new initiative that comes in, and then an ecologist comes along and says, "Oh, actually, but
Yeah.
you didn't think about this?" A good example in the UK is that there was this big campaign called No Mow May, where
Yeah.
people were told not to mow their lawns in May to give pollinators more forage. But
Yeah.
then what everyone did is they left their grass to grow long in May and then went and mowed it in June.
Yeah.
And this led to this huge rise in casualties of things like hedgehogs and other species that had been using this newly unmown long grass to kind of hide in. And then all of a sudden the outrage was, but I thought this is what you told us to do.
Yeah.
We were doing a good thing. We did this thing, and now you're telling us there's all these negative impacts of what we did. We can't win. Well, that's just not, as with so many environmental problems. You strive for perfection, and then people go, you know what? If you told me to do this, but now you're telling me it's not perfect, so why bother? So we've got to be
Why bother?
careful.
Yeah, why bother? And I think that's also again, I think that's what, yeah, that's what we all have to be afraid of because again, it's like how many chances do you have to work with somebody and get somebody's attention, one, then
Mm-hmm.
to have them like kind of work through and then like they build a relationship and a pride and then they get disappointed because again, here's the mom or the dad in this family who like, always had the lawn mowed and then now it's like for 1 month they didn't do and then they find out that it didn't work. Like, and that's so interesting. Again, this is where this behavioral component comes in as well. So again, to be ready when you can. And we've had lots of issues with just technology that didn't work as well that we wanted it to because we weren't ready yet. And I think that's the other piece when you are just when you're just used to these huge, you're used maybe to a Facebook app, you're used to a Google app, which are billion-dollar companies, so it's just absolutely phenomenal. And you don't you're used to just a smooth experience and you have no idea. And then you kind of start to test something from a very small company that is just trying to put something together and you can't log in or there's something like that. And then you get furious and rightly so. I mean, here's, a company claiming something and it doesn't work out the way it does and that's then it's almost like a lost opportunity. So that's something else. Again, I have a huge appreciation for customer support now because I had to do it myself for a long time.
Mm.
And then the other thing as well is like sometimes it's better to again to really test something out and work with people first that are used to seeing something small and seeing something that isn't working that well. And then once we've within the community kind of said, okay, now let's present this to the wider community because as you said, there's a one-time opportunity, one-time chance to like engage people, get them onboarded, and they then have to know, okay, you got my attention. What are the 3 to 6 next steps I can take to make sure that this works well for me? And that then has to
Mm.
be seamless. So I think again, as an entrepreneur and as a community, there's some yeah, there's some cool things we can learn there to not go too fast.
Yeah, I mean that's really difficult, isn't it? Though, because you said earlier we need to start doing things and testing
Hmm.
things, and balancing that with the fact that you don't get too many bites at the cherry. If you get things wrong, is going to be a constant challenge. But
I think
if you
that's
don't
the yeah.
get it out there, then you're going to be constantly, and you worry too much, then it's always going to remain an idea, and the world will never see it. So difficult one.
Yeah, no, I mean you're right, Rob. That's where the sandboxing comes in, right? So
Mm,
is there something again, this is something that we too like we have a couple of people that are like, what's the different cycles or circles that you have, right? So circle one may be your significant other, your parents, your siblings, or wherever. It's like, hey, look at this, is this okay? And then you can kind of go, then you have like maybe your colleagues and coworkers. And then you have maybe if you have like 25 to 50 people that just know, hey, they're aware. And this happens. We have like the beekeeping community is phenomenal. And there's like we've had it so many times that somebody reached out and was like, hey, I noticed that there is this bug. I'm a developer myself. Can I help you test it? Right? Can I help you kind of like work through this? And
mm,
that has worked phenomenally because they're almost appreciative of a bug, right? So that's something that we, again, learning it the hard way, but having a little community out there that is like, hey, we're super ready, super helpful because you need these people. You need
mm.
somebody to work with. You need it to break 18 times so you can go and repair it the 19th time, then to get it right. And every company, specifically technology, started this way. And that's, I think, so they are getting a nice learning community together, a nice group that is close to the hive, so to say, in our language, that is able to just give us very honest, very brutal feedback, so that the biggest wrinkles are ironed out before we launch. And I guess people have told me this before, but I wish I had implemented it earlier. But it's one of these learnings.
Yeah. And so, in terms of building this out and your journey into entrepreneurship and foundership, um, I bet there's been lots of challenges, as you've already pointed out. But what were some kind of maybe unexpected things that you learned along the way that for people out there who are thinking about founding a company or who are just starting out on the entrepreneurial journey? Are there any kind of unexpected lessons that you've learned that might be useful to share?
Yeah, I think so. I think some of it is really the an interesting one, but both for good and for bad is the loneliness, I guess.
Mm,
It's like because you have to be somewhat crazy, I guess, about multiple things to be able I would say it requires one craziness to get started and a whole different level of craziness to not stop.
mm,
That's like that. Those are the two things. So at first, you have to kind of believe, that you are, I don't know, maybe smart enough, or think enough about something that you believe somebody else could use and could be relevant. So that's kind of like, and then be kind of brave enough to like actually try it out. And then you have the biggest one then that comes in is just a r- ridiculous determination to just not give up. And that becomes maybe the tricky one because again, as we said earlier, it's like you have to see something through, but also you have to iterate quickly and you have to sometimes allow ideas to fail, to be able to start something new and not spending the wrong time on something. And that is where it becomes really tricky. And I think this is also in terms of the loneliness where it happens that oftentimes you don't a lot of people who are not founders kind of like ask you, it's like, why are you doing, why are you still trying? Why are you still trying to do this? Or why do you not take on a regular job, right?
mm,
Why don't you, with your education and who you are, you could just settle for something and then just be good and you get, your vacation time paid out and you don't have to worry and you don't have to stress about paying salaries and these kind of things. So and that strength then to stick with it, it's like you have to really be like in a few standard deviations out there on like just persistence as like
mm.
apart from all the other components. I think that's the one that I was not prepared as much for. And I think again, it's one thing realizing it, and then how do you cope and work with it? And that's kind of where building a nice network of other people who are crazy enough to think that they can put something into reality and are also crazy enough to not stop doing it. That I believe is the biggest one. So it's like kind of it's very it's lonely, but you can kind of share the loneliness a
Mm.
little bit by working with people who are in similar positions.
Yeah, I've heard that similar statements before of founders or really successful companies who look back and go, if I knew what the journey was going to look like, or if anyone saw the journey to this point, they'd no one would do it. But it's it takes a special kind of person or determination, like you say, to make it happen.
Yeah, yeah, again, it's you just ask yourself, how hard can it be? Right? Which is kind of that's one of my favorite sayings. It's like that's because that's all you know. That's all you do when you get started. You just say, well, I can do this. How hard can it be? And then kind of, a year later or 2 or 3, you're like, oh wow, this is it. But you continue to ask yourself the same way. So I think there is a little bit of like you have to trick yourself a little bit and bend your mind some, and then be prepared to get questions on it and for it. And but that's the exciting part. So would I do it again? Absolutely. Would I do it differently? Oh yeah.
It sounds like a kind of quite a common answer. I mean, before getting on to a last few roundup questions, Max, I mean, you seem like a very optimistic person to me from our few conversations and interactions. How, when we look at these crises, the biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, that are really urgent, and we look at kind of where we're moving as a society, things like that, these things like COP just happening, there's a lot of noise, but are we seeing actual action that we need to see? Kind of, as someone working on one of these problems day to day, how hopeful do you remain? Do you remain optimistic, or does it kind of ebb and flow a bit?
No, I mean, I guess this is another of my personality traits that I'm just an incurable optimist, I would say, when it comes to these ideas. And I believe that there's so many more people that every time you engage in certain conversations, that people are like, oh, I didn't know that, or wow, what can I do? What can I help? How can I become a better version of this? And it's specifically interesting when we talk about these things like nature or food, which is something that, every person faces at least a couple, oftentimes to a dozen choices per day that can move the needle in one way or the other with how they treat their agri-food systems and nature that just surrounds them. And that's again where I see it as such a huge opportunity for change. And again, it may be in a different way, and it may be more of like, I buy something differently and that follows a different lead or a different change. I think there's a lot of again, policy making that also moves in the right direction. Again, there's more of these landmark decisions, if you will, that take a lot of time of implementing. And I think there's a lot of like, oh, I wish it'd go a little quicker, or I wish it would be more here. But I think I think that we are on a good path, and I remain very, very optimistic. And again, I think I continue to tell the story. And I think it is as entrepreneurs, as people who do podcasts, it's our job to share more stories and to come up with better and easier solutions to contribute more directly and faster to the change that we want to see. And I think there's like a steady pace at which society, institutions, and so on kind of continue to move in that direction. And then there's a speed that you can walk at or go at, and that's what you can control. So I think there's, again, I remain optimistic just by seeing that even, certain people who you would have never thought would buy certain things or move in a certain direction start to acknowledge that, or maybe for different reasons, but get to the same endpoint of say, yeah, no, I wouldn't throw trash out, or I wouldn't, cut that or do that to nature in the same way. So again, I think there's everybody would be willing to do something, and we just haven't found the right way to engage them and the right way to like motivate them to keep going. So yeah, I remain really, really optimistic.
Good. Me too, but I think it's the only way to be, because the alternative is doesn't bear thinking
Grim.
about.
Yeah,
So
it's
yeah,
dark.
exactly. So let's be optimists. Right, I've got a few closing questions,
Sure.
Max, if that's all right. But it's been a great conversation, really enjoyable. Covered loads of different topics and things. So yeah, thanks again. But my first question from this closing set, which I've been asking all the guests in this new series, is the idea of this question, and how I came up with it, is to share the love a bit in terms of, from speaking to entrepreneurs and founders, it tends to be a common pattern that they have loads of ideas written in notebooks, written on pieces of paper everywhere, which they just don't have time to get to. And maybe if they can clone themselves, they would take on these other ideas. So in the interest of kind of trying to get more ideas into fruition, if there's listeners out there who are thinking about wanting to start a business but haven't really got that killer idea yet to get started on, I've been asking guests, have you got any business ideas that you've not managed to start that you would be happy to share for the listeners that might be interesting, no matter how weird or wacky they might be?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really nice question. There's two things actually. There's one that been having for like a long, long time, and I see like bits and pieces of it. It was an idea to make waiting more transparent.
Okay.
So it was actually in the US and in North Carolina where I live, it's quite nice. And in the UK you may have a similar system where you basically you go somewhere and you can make a reservation, but you can put your phone number on a list. And
Mm.
then kind of you can look in and see, you know, how many people are in front of you on the list, how many people are below you. And but having something like that that is universal, where you would be able to have for any government interaction, any interaction with any type of organization, institution, any doctor's offices. So any type of like waiting that you would have to do, there would be a similar system where you would always see and interact with like the time positioning of where you are. So there was one version
Yeah.
that I was going through because I was just very tired. I don't know. I must have come up with this while I was waiting somewhere and thought,
Yeah, in
okay,
a long
I
queue or
could be.
something.
There
Yeah.
you go. I had no idea if I was queuing. You know, that's a big sports in the UK as well. I know
Yeah,
some
we
people
love
are
it.
queuing.
Yeah.
There you go. So yeah, maybe people wouldn't want that in the
No, the
in
app wouldn't
the
take off in the UK, unfortunately, unless it was like, how could you increase your waiting time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Or you can, you know when to go back to. You can offer somebody else your spot, maybe. That was one way. And then I think the other component, which I've also seen, a little bit of, I haven't looked at it into more. I would love for there to be better carbon, climate, and biodiversity fintech solutions and integration. So again, I love that the apps that I've started where whenever you purchase something, there's like 1% that goes towards your saving or investments. There's a couple of companies that have that. But what I would love is there to be a climate, carbon, and a biodiversity component integrated with it. So basically you would, at the end of the month, you see your dashboard, you're like, this is what you paid in rent, this is what your, service subscriptions or software subscriptions, and here's, you had a 2% roundup. So every time you added 2%, this is the budget for the month, and here's sort of the three projects you integrated. You have on the climate side, here's the three projects on the biodiversity side, and maybe there's two that are together. And then you have like this nice pie chart which kind of goes where your money was flowing, and maybe you can have even a nonprofit and a for-profit, so depending if you invest. So there was it's the other one that again, managing money is can be very painful, and there's fortunately a few solutions that are coming up, but then again, making it almost like disappear again, that you're helping the voluntary climate and the voluntary carbon markets, the voluntary biodiversity credit markets that are still super nascent, but that would be like a very meaningful way of directly integrating that in people's spending behavior.
I love that. Yeah, it's again one of those things you need to make it disappear, because as soon as you tell people, where do you know exactly where your your money is going, when it's like, oh, that's a lot of, I've got a job, I've got a family to take care of. I'm not going to look into every single investment my bank's making, for example. So making those things easier
Yeah.
and almost disappear, but allowing people to make better decisions in an
Yeah.
easier way. I
Yeah,
like
and
it.
this and set and forget, right? That's kind of the need. It's like, is there something
Mm,
that you can get set up, and then you just don't have to worry about it, because every time you spend the money, there's a little bit of money that gets put away or saved away. And that's again, it's like this behavioral component, right? I know it myself. It's like anything that just requires a cognitive load that is so high, you're gonna, at some point the system's gonna break. And if you can, put that to like, every time I do this, every time I do X, Y also happens. Yep, I think, more of that, and we will solve our problems, and
yeah. Let's make it
because we're
easy for
humans.
people,
There
even
you
though,
go.
we don't want to, coming back to right at the start of our question, we want to heal that disconnect at the
Yep,
same time, make it easy for people, right? So
there
that's
you
the
go.
challenge. Brilliant. Thanks, Max. And the next question is around, I know you're back in Germany for Christmas, so you might have brought a book with you on the plane. What are you currently reading, or what's currently on your bookshelf that you might want to share with readers? It can be to do with nature and the environment, it can be to do with business, it can be even fiction, that you think that people might be interested in checking out?
Yeah, no, I think that's another very good question. There's actually I would love to mention two. There's two books that I found interesting. One is one that I have here at home. So it's called The Invention of Nature.
Ah.
Have you read it? Have you heard about it?
I have heard of it, but I've never read it for my sins. Yeah, I will
Cool.
definitely
So
add it to the
it's
list.
yeah, no, please do. So it's basically the adventures of Alexander from Humboldt, and they call him a lost hero of science. It's very interesting because his claim to fame can be that he maybe was the first ecologist, or he maybe invented, ecology as a thing, as a concept, and how we look at nature, and how maybe it's a scientific of way. I think there's a lot of people had relationships with nature before in a very different way, but from a European kind of scientific way in terms of appreciating nature and the beauty of nature and giving birth to the field of ecology. He is definitely one of the people who've laid very interesting groundwork. And I've read it before I was even working in beekeeping, and it's a very neat reminder of I guess the beauty of nature and what it does, and specifically where now when we talk about putting a price on things and how do we value natural capital. I think it's worthwhile to understand like the origin story of how we deal with nature and ecology today. So that's one, and then the other one is more of a on a yeah, it's called Outlive. It's more on a personal level. It's a book that deals more with longevity and like exercise in particular, and like what things we can do. The author is called Peter Attia, and what things we can do to improve our lives and basically improve the probability to live longer. So I am currently challenging my dad to see how many pull-ups he will be able to do by the end of the next year,
That's a
which
fun
seems
Christmas activity in
there you go. So
there.
that's gonna be there again. There's much more in there, but again, exercises is always a good one. So I'm again when I fall in love with some ideas, I tend to tell people about it. So yeah, I'm pestering my dad now to see if he can get to 10 to 10 pull-ups.
I look forward to hearing how that goes over Christmas. Thanks for those. I'm definitely going to check those both. I've not read either of those books, so yeah, I'll
Cool.
leave that in the show notes. And I should, yeah, I feel a bit guilty that I've not checked out the first one in particular because it's becoming a classic, or is already a classic in the ecology world. So definitely
That's
need to
yeah,
check it out.
you'll really like it, and it's kind of I also looked. It was a little late coming to it, but there's just some great journeys about it. And I love biographies. I've
Mm,
always loved that's to me been the way to approach history or
same, yeah.
anything meaningful, because it just gives you again combining this human behavioral, the whim, the witty of like of a person within history, and how the intertwined relationships kind of just happen to happen. And Van Humboldt have, seem to have been just a person like that. So it's pretty cool.
Nice. And the final one of these questions I've been asking everyone is the billboard question. So it's the question is around the idea that you could put a quote or anything really on a billboard in your local town or city to get a message out to the masses. So if you had the opportunity to put something on a billboard to get a message out, what would you put on there?
Maybe it's as simple as how hard can it be? I
Nice.
think that's that. I think that is the one. I think it's like there is a lot of, I think a lot of, there should be a lot more people working on their dreams and what they're passionate about. And I think it's if we all ask ourselves, if you really want to change something, and you ask yourself how hard can it be, you may be closer to like actually figuring it out. And I think it's I was debating. It could also be remember why you started or how
Mm,
hard it can be. I think those two are just they get me up in the morning, and I think it's like when I meet somebody who has something on their mind and they're like, hey, I really I should try this out. It's like, well, how hard can it be? Just get started. And then I think the other one of like, remember why you started is a lot of when you get frustrated or bogged down in the process and you're like, nothing is working. It's been a terrible day or, terrible week. And you're just sitting there and kind of go, it's like, what in the world is going on? And then, remember why you started is just a gentle nudge to look back at like all the excitement and all of it, what you wanted to, be it for a relationship or a partnership or a business idea, even that you say, okay, wow, this is no, this is true. So I think somewhere between those two, you'll
Nice.
check out the billboards where
Is
you are on the.
is that how hard can it be? BEE. You know, there could
Thank
be a
you.
new
That's
slogan for
yes, of
HiveTracks
course it
there. You
is.
can
Of
have that
course.
one.
Rob, do you want to work with us?
Yeah.
I think you would, this is the puns are already there. Yeah. Yep. How hard can it be? There you go.
There you go. Perfect. Well, thanks very much again, Max. Those love those answers, and yeah, thanks for the really interesting conversation. I've learned a lot, made tons of notes here as well
I appreciate that.
to follow up on. Any a final kind of call to action from yourself? What would where can people go to find out more about HiveTracks, or just any general call to action for people? You obviously done the billboard, but apart from that, to the listeners, anything you want to share before we sign off?
Yeah, no, thanks so much. Yeah, of course, most of the information, all the information about us and HiveTracks can be on HiveTracks, hivetracks.com, which you will be sharing. And also, you can put my email there as well for people who want to reach out and talk. And then again, I guess to me, it's really like any action is like just, ask the questions. Look at supply chains are a phenomenal example is like ask where stuff comes from, who
Mm,
made stuff, what's the story behind it. And again, usually the more things you buy that have a story, the more sustainable you'll almost automatically live, right? So whether that's food, whether that's furniture, whether that's clothing, anything where you have somewhat of a story, where there's some origin story that you don't even, you don't have to know everybody who did everything, but as long as there's a story because somebody gifted it to you or there's some component to it, usually, you'll become a lot more sustainable again. So search, ask questions and look for the background stories, look for the story of how things are being made, how stuff happen. And I think then we're, yeah, almost halfway on the way. So, and yeah,
I love that. What's
that's
the story?
that's what I would
Yeah,
share. What's the story?
brilliant. Well, thanks, Max. Yeah, brilliant to talk to you, and thanks for taking the time. And yeah, I look forward to keeping an eye on HiveTracks, how it evolves, all these new exciting things you're getting up to in 2024. I'm excited to see.
No, Rob, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. And yeah, thanks for putting this together. This was incredibly exciting. And I've been looking forward to this for a long time. So yeah, I'll be on the lookout for many more episodes and for bringing together so many people in the industry to help get these ideas out. So thanks so much for your time and have a great weekend ahead.